That's right. I'm afraid we've got serious problems with the silicon from MPW1, and in this video I'm going to be looking at what they are and how it happened. We first got wind of this a couple of weeks ago when it was publicly announced on the Skywater Google group that there were some problems with the silicon from MPW1. This video shows it is possible to load some firmware and flash an LED, but unfortunately it's not possible to control the GPIOs. So the GPIO that is flashing at the moment is this one that's inside the management area, but we can't set up the GPIO pins to turn them into inputs or outputs, and that means that any projects that depend on them working are not going to work, and that includes all of mine, unfortunately. So how did this happen and what was the cause of it? This is something that is still being worked out by eFabless and the community, but I wanted to get out the information that I've learned so far. I've put everything in this document that I've discovered so far, and as we learn more, we'll fill out the missing details. Most of this information is coming from the Skywater Slack on the MPW1 Silicon channel, so if you want to get the root source, then that's the place to sign up and check out. Mohammed Kasim, the CTO from eFabless, has agreed to sit down and have an interview with me in a couple of weeks' time, so we should be able to fill in any missing parts of the information then. So during bring-up of these samples, the eFabless team found that they could get this LED to flash, but they couldn't get the GPIO to program. And even getting the firmware loaded and the GPIO LED flashing was difficult and depended on the voltage level and how hot or cold the chip was. And these are indications that there's a problem with hold violations in a flip-flop. Now, one of the questions I asked in the Skywater Slack channel was, can we not fix this just by slowing down the clock? And TNT replied that unfortunately with hold violations, that's not possible. And that really confused me, and I realized that I didn't really get a full understanding of what a hold violation is. So I was up all night trying to work out, and then the next day I was doing some reading. And over the course of the last week, I've been working on my explanation. So I'm going to put it into practice now and try to explain exactly what a hold violation is and why it's such a crucial problem. Digital logic can be broadly split into two categories, combinatorial and sequential. With combinatorial logic, when the input changes, we get this propagation delay and then the output starts to change. And this amount of time just depends on how long the logic tree is. With a flip-flop, in comparison, the output should only change dependent on the clock and the input data. So let's zoom in and have a closer look at this timing diagram. We actually need the input data to stay constant in this little window before the rising edge, and this is called the setup time. And it's also got to stay constant for a moment after we sample, and that's called the hold time. And then after we've done the sampling on the clock edge, there's some amount of internal delay before the output is updated. And there's a little window of time here where the output is unpredictable. And if the input data does change in either the setup or the hold window, then we can get a problem called metastability, where the output will take a long time to settle to a state and we can't predict what that state will be. So I'll do another future video more in depth on how flip-flops work, but that's enough for us to get started. So now imagine that we've got two flip-flops separated by some combinatorial logic, like an adder. And we want to know how fast we can run the clock before we get a problem. So the data coming in stays solid in the setup time. We clock, the new data goes on the output, ripples through, gets processed by the combinatorial logic. This takes a certain amount of time as well. And then there's this little bit of window here called the slack, where the data is solid before we enter this setup region. So as we increase the frequency and decrease the period, we'll see that eventually this undetermined logic here will push its way into the setup window, and that will cause metastability problems. If we've already taped this out onto an ASIC and we can't change it, we can decrease the clock frequency, and that will pull this moment where the data is changing out of the setup window, and then we'll remove that problem. So now we're moving on to what hold violations are. So to make this easier to explain, what I've done is remove this combinatorial logic, and we've just got two flip-flops in a row. So if both flip-flops receive the clock at exactly the same time, then we've got the same thing that we had before, where D is constant in the setup window, gets sampled, comes out, and the data is changing. But that data changing is happening after the hold window is finished for the second flip-flop. And a crucial difference between setup and hold timing is that setup is related to two separate clocks, whereas hold is related to one clock edge. So now imagine if we get some positive clock skew. That means that the clock for the second flip-flop is a bit delayed in comparison with the first flip-flop. And what that does is it moves the clock window further forwards in relation to the first clock. So the output of the first flop is the same, Q is still changing here. But now what's happening is because the second clock is arriving a little later, that change is actually happening in the hold window. And that means we're going to get a hold violation and meta stability problems, but we can't do anything about it because changing the clock frequency doesn't change anything to do with when those clock edges arrive. But one thing that causes clock to arrive at different times is to do with variations in the process, for example, whereabouts on the wafer that die came from, and things like how long it takes for the signals to travel down wires. And those are things that can change with temperature or voltage, which explains why eFabless found that by changing the temperature or the voltage, they were able to sometimes get better or worse results. So you might be asking why we didn't catch this problem before we taped out for MPW1, and that's a really good question. And the answer is that we thought it was. There's a tool called OpenSTA, and that does static timing analysis. And this is being run in two different places in the open lane flow. So importantly, after clock tree synthesis and routing, we then extract the parasitics, the capacitances and the resistances, and then we use OpenSTA to check again. And that should tell us whether there's a problem in the clock tree. Now there was a clue actually waiting all along that nobody spotted. If you look at this report from OpenSTA after the clock tree and the parasitic extraction, you can see that the rising edge and the clock network delay were both set to 0, and that's a bit of a red flag. So what went wrong there? We're still not totally sure, but there's at least two things. One is that we didn't have the full parasitics of the clock network because we were missing some information, and that information is now being provided by a tool called OpenRCX. And the second thing is, it looks like there was a misconfiguration with how OpenSTA was actually being run, so it wasn't paying attention to clock propagation. When we add both those things and then rerun the checks, we can see that the clock network for Caravel has a 10 nanosecond skew, and that causes all the hold violations that have been causing these problems. So that's bad, but at least we've got now the simulation and the real silicon matching up, so that gives us better confidence for the future. So what does this mean for MPW1, MPW2 and MPW3? Well, MPW1, some people's designs may work depending on the kind of thing that they did, and eFabless are doing the packaging and the test boards and sending out that silicon anyway. And I'm at least looking forward to getting my dies scanned and having the images. MPW2 hasn't yet been sent for getting the masks cut, so there's still time to make some changes. And eFabless is very busy looking at the Caravel clock tree and working out how they can improve that and fix it ready so that there's not too much of a delay. And we're still waiting to know whether we're going to need to update our designs or not, and how to get a proper check to see if we've got the same problems in our own designs that we had in the Caravel harness. For MPW3, OpenRCX is already providing the proper parasitics, and it looks like the OpenSTA configuration has been fixed. So it seems that MPW3 tooling is already ready to go, and there shouldn't be a delay. So obviously it's a real shame that a lot of us won't get working chips out of MPW1 after a lot of people have put a lot of work in. But it's important to see this in the bigger perspective. This is the first shuttle out of an ongoing run with new tools and a new PDK, and some problems were inevitable to crop up. A lot of us are very new to the ASIC game, including myself, and this is maybe a reason why we weren't able to spot this problem with the OpenSTA reports. As the community grows and learns, this kind of information gets folded back into the tools and added into the checks to prevent it from happening in the future. And I'll be submitting my WS2812 LED driver and my VGA clock into MPW3, so I'm still hoping to see those designs working on real silicon soon. So if you're interested in learning more about this yourself and even making your own chips, then sign up today to the Zero to ASIC course.